Now it's time for perspective on the programme. And how many times have you sat at home, perhaps even watching this programme, and thought, that's terrible, but there's not really much that I could ever do about it? Well, my guest today is one of those who's tried and succeeded to do something about it. He's the co-founder and Chief Policy Impact and Government Affairs Officer at Global Citizen. That's a group that's raised over $40 billion to fight poverty and other issues as well, such as climate change and inequality. Well, Michael Sheldrick joins us on the programme now. Thanks very much for joining us. I summed it up very briefly, but tell us a little bit more about what Global Citizen is and what you've achieved.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the program. You know, Global Citizen, we were really founded on the premise that if you take issues like extreme poverty and climate change, these are inherently structural issues, right? Some estimates suggest to end extreme poverty, you need something like an additional $350 billion a year, which to viewers at home, that sounds like a lot of money. But when we put it in perspective, the US government 2 years ago approved $800 billion for its military, right? Just to put it in perspective. And so this really comes down to issues of priority and how we put it on the agenda of political leaders. And so Global Citizen was developed as a platform for ordinary citizens to raise their voice, take action, and recognizing that no amount of charity gala night dinners, as important as they are, is going to be enough to raise issues. And as you pointed out, through the tremendous work of our partners, we've seen over $40 billion committed and delivered over the last decade, which has helped impact the lives of some 1 billion people. But I do want to say impact doesn't happen in a vacuum, and we're proud that we've worked with some phenomenal NGOs, including here in France and across Europe. Our current campaign, Power Our Planet, is backed by 75 NGOs around the world. So it is always in partnership. And of course, coming back to the role of citizens, because we know without citizen-led accountability, there is no road to delivery.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously become an enormous thing, a massive thing. What you were saying there about citizens, you also encourage people, don't you, to think of themselves not necessarily as a Frenchman or a Brazilian or an American, but to think of them as global citizens, and therefore they can act for the planet rather than for individual states?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in this day and age, we saw through the pandemic, but increasingly we see with climate change, right? Whether it's our actions here in France or actions on the other side of the world, how they all have an impact here. You know, we're hearing a lot of statistics about increased migration as a result of climate change. And so for us, it's really about not just showing how these issues like climate change impact all of us, it's also giving concrete solutions. So for example, if you go on the Global Citizen platform right now, one of the issues you can take is calling on the World Bank to introduce something called debt clauses, which sounds very jargony, but it's essentially saying for small island nations who did little to contribute to the issue of climate change, if they face an extreme weather event like a hurricane, there should be an automatic suspension in their debt repayments so they can bounce back and recover. And this is something which institutions like the World Bank and even like the European Commission, who over the next few days we'll see if they step up, we've seen that they need to be responsive to pressure. If they're not hearing it from citizens, how can we expect them to step up? Because as much as we would like those in power to do the right thing, we know that with so many competing priorities, they need to be reminded of what's important.
How do you conquer that fear, if that's the right word, of people, thinking, as I said at the top there, there's not much I can do about this?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Generation Z, there are statistics out there amongst young people, so a phenomenal, or not quite a majority, but something like 47% say that they're disillusioned, right? This sense of apathy and really feeling like the future has nothing in store for them. But you're also seeing this rise of interest in issues like climate change, in issues like extreme poverty, in issues like inequality, and also this rise in political engagement, right? People are actually aware that they need to be involved. The channel is how do you funnel that? And I've always believed that, people respond to hope, right? People respond, they're more likely to have their head in the sand if they don't think their actions are going to make a difference. And so what we've seen, through our campaigns, for instance, we've seen in 2021, when we were last here in France, we saw businesses and governments pledge to protect and reforest 157 million trees. Last year, we saw 77 million of those trees delivered upon, right? In large part to the great work of partners, NGOs around the world. The challenge is sharing that story to keep people motivated and show them that their voices do have an impact, whether that's through the Global Citizen platform or another platform.
And what you're talking about partners, I mean, it's sort of perfectly illustrated this week, isn't it? Because you're here for this enormous global concert. Past some of it being set up this morning, in fact, on my way in. It's a huge concert this Thursday night. It's called Power Our Planet. You've got huge stars involved, Lenny Kravitz, Billie Eilish, people like that. I mean, it's a massive way, isn't it, of kind of drawing people in and getting them involved?
Yeah, no, that's right. And look, we're thrilled to be back in Paris. President Macron, to his credit, is organising this summit. He's calling it a summit for a new global financial pact. He's the only G7 leader to host a summit on these major issues. So full credit to him. The question is will leaders deliver? And that's why with 76 NGOs and co-chaired by the phenomenal Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, who I think is one of the most inspirational leaders, we put together this campaign, Power Our Planet, Act Today to Save Tomorrow. And we're converging, as you said, in front of the Eiffel Tower this week to send a very clear message. Number one, we need governments to deliver on the promises they've already met. Number two, we need them to reform institutions like the World Bank so that they're able to respond to the challenges of poverty and climate change. And three, we just need more resources so that we can step up and help countries around the world in a just and fair transition.
Is it really realistic? I mean, it's so ingrained, isn't it, the systems that we have. Trying to change them and that gear change is almost impossible, isn't it?
Well, I think, Nelson Mandela said famously, it's always impossible until it's done. And then it seems like it was inevitable. And we've seen how quickly, we saw in response to the war in Ukraine, how quickly the West, resolved. I don't think anyone, when President Putin launched his illegal invasion of Ukraine, I don't think anyone expected the West to be so united in their response in aid and delivery. So we've actually seen how in extraordinary times, countries can come together. We saw this during the pandemic, where the West injected trillions of dollars in economic stimulus. So it's not a question that we can't do it, it's a question of will. And we've shown that we can do it. That same resolve we've shown with the war in Ukraine and this united response, now we need to step up and show that on the issues of climate justice. And it can be done, but it won't be done unless we use our voice.
Lots of optimism. Thanks very much for coming in and telling us about it, telling us about the concert as well. Michael Sheldrick joining us from Global Citizen. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.